Welcome, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is Internet Policy Wars 3.0, is the path to prologue to the fight for Web3, ? Thank you all for coming. This event is hosted by the Congressional Internet Caucus Academy, and we've been doing these briefings since 1996 in conjunction with the Congressional Internet Caucus itself, which is a group of members on Capitol Hill in the House and Senate. The co-chairs of the Congressional Internet Caucus on the House side are Congresswoman Anna Eshoo and Congressman Michael McCall. And on the Senate side, it's Senator Patrick Leahy and Senator John Thune. And we're thrilled that they are willing to co-host these events with us. A few thanks I need to send out. I want to thank the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web, which is in part responsible for this event, and also the Internet Society, who's doing a global simulcast of this event to their audience. So thank you to both of them. Before we get going, a little bit of housekeeping. Our Twitter account, where we might be putting out some information about this event, is at NetCaucusAC, and the hashtag for today is #governance3. So before I introduce our moderator, I just want to say we're really excited about this event. It spans the entire arc of our history for the Congressional Internet Caucus and the Congressional Internet Caucus Academy, from the mid-1990s all the way through to today. I think we're at the precipice of a new iteration of the internet, and we're talking about policymaker awareness. And this is super important to us. And this has been our mission for the past 25 years. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to our expert, who is our moderator today, is Danny O'Brien. Some of you may know Danny from his work at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Danny was with the foundation for many, many years. And now he is a senior fellow with the Filecoin Foundation and the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web. So let me just hand it over to Danny, and Danny, take it from here.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for coming. As the title describes, we have a little sort of conceit that we're playing with, which is that the moment that we see right now, where the first sort of rumblings of an understanding that something is happening in the Web3 blockchain cryptocurrency space right now. And I think there's a genuine interest in Washington to both understand that and create the environment that's good for its users and good for innovation and good for society in general. But it's a little challenging to work out what that was. And as Tim said, I think for some of us, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Somebody said in the past, and I presume by extension, someone will say that again in the future. And there have been some echoes of that moment in the 90s when lawmakers, policymakers, and almost everybody else in the world realized that there was a new entrant in the field of not just communication, but almost every part of our world. And the decisions that were made there, I think, for those of us who were involved in that to some degree, and I'm very happy to say that many of our panelists were there at the beginning. It didn't feel like there was a coherent approach here. There was a lot of learning to do. There was a lot of mistakes made, and there were a lot of short-term thinking, trying to work out what needed to be done next. But the truth is that entire period set the scene for what we see now, and also set the scene for what will happen in the next 30 years. From the Section 230 to the throwing out of the rest of the Communications Decency Act by the courts, to the fight over whether cryptography, strong cryptography, should be a prohibited export. And of course, that underlies not only what security we have on the current internet, but the very foundations of what we're also going to be talking about, Web3 and the crypto world. All of those were established in those last 10 years and in that mad scrabble. To give us a little bit of insight on that mad scrabble and how it might connect to the current mad scrabble is I'm very delighted to introduce Kevin Werbach. Kevin's the author of The Blockchain and the New Architecture of Trust, and of course now professor at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. But back then, he really did have not only a window seat on the digital revolution, but a huge influence on how, in particular, the FCC, where he was the person sort of leading the policy technology development in that area. And also, Kevin, you were editor for many years of Esther Dyson's Release 1.0, which I think, if not invented, certainly popularized this idea of having a single decimal point after an integer, which is what we're dealing with Web 3.0. So, Kevin, what was it? What kind of things were you seeing in Washington as a response, and like, what do you think was they got right, and what do you think they got wrong?
Oh, thanks to Net Cogs for having me on this. So it's interesting. At some level early on, there was a tremendous amount of excitement about the internet. Only it really wasn't the internet we were talking about in the early 90s. It was what Al Gore and others called the information superhighway, or later it was called the National Information Infrastructure. Really, we were talking about applications that, someday you will do your banking online and you will get your healthcare online, you go to school online, all kinds of crazy fantasies like that. But generally, it was discussed in the context of proprietary online services. AOL was the dominant service back then, or new kinds of government-based systems that would be built. And the internet sort of came about and really came to the fore during that time period. And what's interesting was, on the one hand, there was a recognition that it was important for policymakers and regulators to consider the effects on innovation and to avoid doing things that would prevent the internet from reaching its potential. So when I moved into the position at the FCC, being in charge of internet policy, my boss said, "Well, you can make up your title." And I said, "Oh, that's great." And he said, "Well, there's only one word you cannot use in your title." I said, "Oh, what's that?" He said, "Internet." And, "Well, why is that? I'm doing internet policy." He said, "Well, if people in Silicon Valley and the internet companies and the technologists hear that there's a guy at the FCC, the Federal Communications Regulator, the federal censor, as it were, of content and media, that does internet policy, they're going to think that means the FCC is coming for you." And we're not. So my title was Counsel for New Technology Policy instead. But there was that recognition that many of the traditional structures that we had weren't quite a good fit. Yet at the same time, when you look at what started to happen as the internet started to develop, really some of the earliest things were initiatives to try and limit it or restrain it or take action. So, of course, in 1996, when Congress passed the Communications Act rewrite, it included virtually nothing whatsoever about the internet. It's important that people to understand this was 1996, so it wasn't that early. But this massive law essentially ignores the internet, except for the part which said indecent content on the internet is illegal. That's what the CDA was. Now, people now tend to forget about that because that part of the law was overturned 9-0 by the Supreme Court as an infringement on the First Amendment. The piece that remains is Section 230, which was the countervailing piece that was put in by initially Senators Cox and Wyden to provide this safe harbor for online service providers in light of those restrictions. The restrictions were overturned, but it's important to understand that Congress was thinking, what do we need to do seeing this new technology? Some of them immediately said, well, we've got to deal with bad stuff, with pornography and indecency. Similarly, we had examples of incumbent companies. We saw this a lot at the FCC. Communications is regulated. And we had, first of all, the phone companies coming to us and saying, the internet's killing our networks. This was, remember, dial-up internet before broadband. They said, our networks are getting totally overloaded. We need to charge per minute rates to internet service providers. This would have killed the internet if you had to pay every minute that you were online, the same kinds of rates you had to pay at that point for long distance services. So we had to, at the FCC, put this out for public comment. And so I came up with the really stupid idea that we should create an email box where you could send an informal comment to the FCC. This was at the point where the only way you could file a comment with the FCC was on paper. But I said, well, let's there's this email thing. Let's just let people email us their comments informally. And Steve Case, the CEO of AOL, decided that his monthly chat with AOL users. Remember, AOL was the dominant provider of millions of users. He said, well, the FCC wants your views, AOL users, on whether there should be this tax, these permanent charges on internet access. I get this call from the CIO of the FCC saying the Federal Communications mail server has crashed because hundreds of thousands of comments are coming in. What did you do? I said, well, we let people say what they think. That had an impact. Although, even though that proposal or request for comment didn't go anywhere at the FCC, thankfully, later on in Congress, Senator Ted Stevens and a faction of mostly rural state senators came back to the FCC and said, you have to impose these access charges because we need it to fund universal service programs. And the FCC actually had to do a lot of work to very carefully respond to say, well, no, we care, of course, about universal service and funding it, but the way to get there is not to put these massive additional charges on internet services. So there were these series of actions. There also was a proposal I got at the FCC from the Long Distance Resellers Association that specifically asked us to ban internet telephony, voice over IP. They said this should be stopped because it's unregulated voice over the internet. And again, we found a way to not do something really stupid. So it's important not to think that this meant that there was this massive industry that was trying to kill the internet in every respect, but there was a lot of lack of understanding. And at that point, the internet community was really small. There were only a few tens of millions of people in the entire world on the internet. And when we talked about the internet industry, it was Netscape, a browser vendor. There were a handful of companies that were around. But fortunately, I think there was a recognition of the potential. There were many thoughtful people in government who saw that. Ultimately, we came together in creating in 1997 what was called the Framework for Global Electronic Commerce through the Clinton White House, which really put a stake in the ground, not just in the US, but globally, had a huge impact on other countries where the US government, the federal government said, no, we think the private sector should lead. There are regulatory issues that need to be addressed, but we should do them in the context of the potential for innovation. So I think largely we got it right, but it was not always obvious going through that that's the direction we were going to go.
That's fascinating. I mean, so I think one of the things that you can draw from this is that often in the very earliest days, the laws that have the most effect on a new technology are ones that aren't necessarily aimed or even thinking about it. It's because they have to grow and thrive within the pre-existing regulatory structure. So Andrew, I realize that each of these introductions is going to consist of going, you are this now, but in a former life, you were something completely different. Andrew, right now, you're the president of an amazing startup, which is actually looking to reform the very nature of architecture, particularly for high density living in New York. But before that, you were, of course, the Deputy US Chief Technology Officer at the White House. You spent some time at Google, but like as we go back in the time machine, at this point, you were really at the head of where regulation and the internet met, which was at ICANN, the organization that sort of maintains and still maintains the domain name system. So when you go to a web address and type in a name, where that name goes and who originally got that name to point it that way is all determined by this sort of quasi-government but global now organization. Can you walk us through a little bit about what you saw with these winds of proposals buffeting you as you kind of tried to steer this ship through those early days?
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, I'll just say, like, as you can see from my background, we're engaged in some very advanced cinder block and rusting hardware architecture. It's kind of a throwback to a kind of an older time. I'm actually in an industrial park in New Jersey because we're at this facility we're prototyping like our very cool architectural approach, and so hence my sexy background. So I got my start. I mean, I should just say, Kevin and I were law school classmates, and we both got chucked out into the world of kind of like Washington law early on. And our timing was extraordinary. So like, I'm deeply jealous of Cleve and Carlos and your counterparts who are, where we were some time ago as a kind of like rising set of technologies kind of hit the world and hit the world of policy and regulation. The way that I got into this was that I was like the junior most and easily most useless lawyer on the team that challenged the Communications Decency Act. So this was at the firm of Jenner and Block, and I was just a new associate there, and I wormed my way onto this case. And part of how I talked my way on was because I had been like sufficiently poor in college that I had to become an internet person in what was then BitNet days in order to learn to use email, to keep in touch with high school friends. That's kind of like my origin story. And when I was at the law firm and this case came down as a First Amendment case, I went into the partner's office and I was like, I know how this stuff works, like with my crossed fingers behind my back, and that case, as Kevin said, went up to the Supreme Court. It was a super experience for a very junior lawyer. And anyway, that kind of like randomly, that sort of random event allowed me to go back to Harvard Law School as a fellow in internet law, right at the beginning of the Berkman Center there. And that led to my befriending John Postel, who was the kind of engineer figure of like Buddha-like wisdom and respect across the community, who had been doing the DNS and IP address allocation literally himself with a couple of grad students for 15 years by that point. And as Kevin pointed out, the Clinton administration was trying to formalize its approach to the internet. And one of the things that they decided, quite rightly, was that this one-person shop in Los Angeles probably needed to turn into a proper entity. And anyway, very tragically, John Postel had a heart attack and died right when this process was getting going. And because I happened to be around and I had some free time, I sort of dove in and I became arguably, depending on if you count paycheck numbers, the first employee of ICANN, and its chief policy officer. So what that was an effort to create an entity which was government adjacent, but not governmental, global, but accountable, and multi-stakeholder in its approach to make policies for this very specific set of resources that weren't really scarce, but they had to have uniqueness as one of their attributes. And so global coordination was like sort of seen to be essential. Anyway, I thought I would just mention kind of like three themes that came around from those early battles. One of which is the theme of moral panics. So a thing that is happening right now with distributed technologies, blockchain-based technologies and others, is that you see people overestimating the threats, the novelty, and the jeopardy that's created by the new technology, because it seems to heighten and accentuate the capacity for harm. And so we see that happening right now. The fears about terrorist financing, child sex abuse imagery transactions, arms deals, money laundering. I'm not at all saying that those things are not present. They're present in all the financial systems of the world. But the moral panic fear is that these new technologies are going to be somehow a step function change in the ability of those malevolent uses to take place and be executed, and maybe to be executed without detection or any possibility of law enforcement. So that's one thing that we saw with Senator Exxon's, Blue Book back in the internet days. The internet is for porn, and that's it. And we see a similar kind of like moral panic happening right now. And I hope one of the things we can talk about today is actually like a more proper contextualization of what these technologies are good for. And then a second one is incumbent arbitrage. So one thing that absolutely happens when a new technology comes along is that incumbent industries suddenly fear like their basic business models are going to be uncompetitive. They're going to get disintermediated, to use the kind of language of internet law. And what that means is they will either use existing regulations and try to get government to interpret them. For example, incumbent telecom companies trying to get the FCC or Congress to treat voice over IP as an illegal, unregulated service that must be wedged into the existing voice regulations, because in the existing world of voice regulations, through some combination of regulatory capture, expertise, and maybe just substantive regulation, they can eke out the persistence of their business model in the face of a disruptive technology. So we saw the same thing with the recording industry and the motion picture industry, trying to figure out how to maintain existing networks of distribution of content in the face of networks that could blow them open and create all kinds of alternatives, some legal, some illegal for sure, but the incumbents moved. And I think what I would say right now is that we're probably going to see financial institutions try to figure out how to avoid becoming disintermediated through some combination of embracing the new technologies, leveraging regulatory and policy processes where possible or where necessary in their view. And that's just something to be conscious of. Incumbents will try to use the policy process to substantiate or to kind of harden their economic positions. And then the third one is what I think I can properly credit to Professor Jamie Boyle from Duke, the libertarian gotcha. So the libertarian gotcha was a theme that came out in the 90s. It has some real utility, which is to say, with a new technology, if you regulate it, you will destroy it. The new technology is good and powerful, but if you regulate, you will destroy what you like about it. And I think the thing that to be on the lookout for there is claims of absolute immunity from regulation. Because I think if there's one thing that we've seen over the last 2 decades, the public has very much evolved, governments have evolved, regulators have evolved to understand that new technologies do not serve the public interest when they are completely devoid of any form of consumer protection or mechanism for vindicating the public interest broadly construed. And so those are 3 things: moral panics, incumbent self-protection, and the libertarian gotcha to be on the lookout for. As Kevin said, I will just stress my own agreement that we actually got most things right back in the 90s. I think with some of the application layer services and their ability to monopolize, ad revenues, social networking features or whatever, there's a whole bunch of things that we have not gotten right. And I hope to see us still get right. But broadly speaking, in the early days of the internet, a light-handed approach, an avoidance of overreaction in the face of moral panics or in some incumbent self-protection, and some efforts towards consumer protection and so forth, I think was the right mix. And maybe that's, if there's one set of lessons from the 90s, it's that's not a bad starting point for a new, powerful, global distributed technology like blockchains and so forth.
That's great. I mean, one of the observations I sort of draw from that, particularly this thing of incumbents trying to protect themselves, is, of course, like we're talking about Web 1.0 100 or so years ago, but there's also now, I think the incumbents in this space are often Web 2.0, right? Facebook, Google, these large giants. And Tim and I were talking before the event, and we were both sort of considering, like, how widely do we want to view this? At the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web, we don't just think about the blockchain and the finance area. We also think about these opportunities to create things that can re-decentralize the internet and take things away. But this is a moment where I think regulators are really looking hard about how best to rein back these big incumbents. And I think there's a risk that the incumbents will do this kind of Aikido, where they'll take those rules and you'll have them as part of the conversation, and they'll try and direct it at these new services. Okay, I now turn to Cleve. Cleve, I have a million notes here, and I don't even know how to describe, but all I would do is urge everybody to read Cleve's book, Clever Revolution. She's a fellow Gen Xer like myself, and I think what's interesting in this context, many interesting things, not least the playlist. I love a book with a playlist. Is that you have a foot in both camps of both regulation and this new world. And it's a little bit more in this Web 2.0 space. You were in the Obama White House. You were communications director for Barbara Lee. And now you're the head of the National Policy Network of Women of Color in Blockchain. So you moved from the Washington circus to the crypto circus at this very key moment. So, and also reading the book, you see that as a kind of, I'm putting words in your mouth, but kind of as a liberatory process. Like, you came to blockchain not to, make your bazillions, but because you saw this as an empowering technology for those who haven't been best served by the existing systems, including Web 2.0. So I don't have a question here. I just wanted to maybe fill in what that meant and what you've seen in both DC and in the crypto space.
Yes, thank you, Danny. I'm thrilled to be here. Before I begin, I do want to thank our host, the Congressional Internet Caucus Academy, and one of the event sponsors, the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web. They promote the development of open source software and open protocols for decentralized data storage and retrieval networks. And they are actually part of the Blockchain Association, and I'm an advisor to the Blockchain Association. So this is a great topic, right? Because as you mentioned, we're in Web 2.0, and where are we going, right? So today, the internet is actually in the very early stages of an architectural shift back to more decentralized and open applications that many call Web 3. Now, Web 3 is not a new concept. Jeffrey Zeldman, one of the early developers of Web 1.0 and 2.0 applications, expressed the need for Web 3 back in 2006. Let's face it, there's broad consensus that the internet is broken. At the heart of the concerns is the monetization of the public's data by a handful of centralized owners of today's internet. And there's broad outrage about privacy breaches, surveillance, misinformation, attacks on diversity. So what is Web 3? Well, it is fueled by a fusion of technologies: artificial intelligence, machine learning, decentralized finance, peer-to-peer blockchain applications like smart contracts, which are all paving the way for Web 3. The vision is a new type of internet with digital infrastructure to solve the deep-rooted problems currently plaguing Web 3. Web 3 leverages new technologies to facilitate more secure, personalized data sharing, ensuring that the internet is interconnected, interoperable, seamless in a decentralized manner. Filecoin Foundation is a leader in this space. We actually can restore trust, expand access, enable microtransactions, and enhance peer-to-peer data file storage. The stakes are high. According to a recent report by the Pew Research Center, around 7 in 10 Americans use social media to connect with one another, engage with news content, share information, and entertain themselves. And to bring it back to our conversation today, as we've shared, in the 1990s, Washington debated the merits and potential of the internet. Today, blockchain and cryptocurrency face similar federal scrutiny, but there is a difference. Issues around inclusion and education were minimal 25 years ago, but today, at the heart of the regulatory and policy debate around blockchain and cryptocurrency, those issues, right? People want to talk about bias in design. People are concerned about the digital divide. Accessibility is something we should be talking about. And certainly the learning curve for non-technical users must be front and center as Web3 evolves. Blockchain's promise of increased financial inclusion and infrastructural freedom and innovation beyond digital currencies is real. And with Web3, Web3 is one of the spaces where we can definitely leverage decentralized technologies as well as machine learning, artificial intelligence, and not just solve the problems of Web 2, but also create a better experience for users in the innovation economy.
Thank you, Cleve. That was great. I mean, I didn't want to blow our trumpet too much, but so just so people know, the Filecoin Foundation, Filecoin is one of these crypto systems, but we're actually concerned with storage. So I think it's one of those areas where, and I think this is something that we'll touch on with Carlos, is there's more to this than finance, but I think finance lies at the heart of it, and maybe we can talk about this more widely. And I know that one of the things that I've seen that gave me a window into the possibilities here and how it maps to Web 1.0 is Carlos is the Brave browser. So Brave is a new browser. It was founded by the creator of JavaScript, so that goes back to Netscape and that early wash of novelty in the 90s. But it's a browser that has a lot of these Web 3.0 features kind of seamlessly put in. So you don't have to depend on websites. You can switch to sites that are stored in a more decentralized, more resilient way using IPFS. And also it has domains that aren't controlled by ICANN. So this is like an alternative, a wider sort of competitive space for even choosing where you can go on this certainly wider internet. So, but Carlos, I actually wanted to talk to you not just about what Brave is doing, but actually, again, your sort of path is really interesting. Just to give one of the things I think illuminated people in Web 1.0 is watching people flock to this new industry and kind of define it, and what their thoughts about how the future should be was really defined by those young people kind of walking into this and defining it, just as Kevin and Andrew and Cleve kind of defined that in their past. So Carlos, tell me a little bit about your passage and like what you, as someone who's heavily involved in this on a day-to-day basis, see as being the promise of this area and what it will grow into.
Well, from my own journey, yes, it began, I was as a high school teacher. And really, when I started learning about, to go for the blockchain and cryptocurrency aspect, this idea of disintermediating from institutions, peer-to-peer direct, I do know that I used to drive 4 miles from the highway exit in the Bronx, right near Fordham, to my high school, and I did not see one bank branch. And when I started going down the rabbit hole in this whole blockchain cryptosphere, you heard a lot about banking the unbanked. And that's a siren call. It's a big platitude people talk about, but they would talk about far-flung places. And so I realized, just sitting there at my desk when I was waiting for my students to come in, looking out the window, that I was sitting in the shadow of the financial capital of the world with the largest population of unbanked people in the city, if not the country. Where I was teaching was Morrisania, which is the poorest congressional district in the United States. And so things just started connecting. But if I can talk about with Brave, one thing that I think is interesting to really illuminate for us is that, Brave rests on 2 pillars, right? The first of which is privacy, and the second of which is consent. And the privacy piece is very interesting in the fact that, as you said, our founder created JavaScript, but then created it and not seeing where it would be taken by other people, and how, really Web 2.0 is based on the exploitation of people's data and exploitation in general. And really what Web 3, or, in terms of, from my view, blockchain creates is the idea that we can have the ability to have ownership in our own data, in our own value, in our own capital. And it presents an opportunity for those that are maybe, with the correct education, become sophisticated enough and savvy enough to take advantage of it and leverage it. And when I taught a couple of boot camps on cryptocurrency and blockchain in the South Bronx before I was hired in Brave, and it really came out of this idea that teaching these students how to leverage new technology, not only for the personal benefit in terms of value, but also for a new industry. There's a large crypto industry in New York City, and my idea was to create a funnel of talent that can go directly from, let's say, communities in the South Bronx to these companies to work. But what Brave does that I think it kind of really fits in here is that, if you choose to opt into Brave Rewards, for example, you earn our utility token, which is the basic attention token. And when I was a teacher, we talked a lot about equity and access. And so really there is one universal thing that we all have, which Web 2.0 really was able to leverage, is our attention. And so no matter who you are, you have eyes, you have attention. Brave found a way using blockchain to commodify that attention and also return it back to the user. Now that user can now use that to really reward their favorite content creators and publishers. Wikipedia is my favorite example. If you've used Wikipedia in the last 5 years, that big pop-up comes up from Jimmy Wells asking for $3. You can use Brave to contribute to that. And so that's one example that I see in terms of the promise of what this technology can give, because no matter who you are, what your background is, what language you speak, if you're going to utilize these tools, you can obtain value. And so, and then you're able to use that value how you see fit. And so you're able to really gain what the whole peer-to-peer promise is, right? The intermediaries have taken all the value, and here you have an opportunity to take that value yourself, and then use it to pay for things like a VPN or a premium video chat product. And there's many things in the pipeline, but my point is that the real power here is the idea of taking an opportunity for the first time to empower those communities that have not been able to leverage and take advantage of the status quo. And so I like to think this is a new frontier. I mean, I joke with a friend of mine who's a history professor in St. John's and say, this is kind of discovering the new world. This is the Europeans coming to the new world, and they're, regardless of whatever the horrible history that happened, it did create a new world for us. And it's almost like an outcropping of the Homo Genocene, where the whole world was linked through plants and species for the first time. And now this is happening digitally. And so this is a point where digitally it can be taken advantage of for those who learn. And so where I come in my view of it, is that I want to try to empower as many people as I can to learn about this and to be able to leverage it.
Cool. Thank you, Carlos. So I kept forgetting to say, so there will be a mad rush that, well, we don't have the chat turned on, so you can't reply to any of the things I'm putting in it. We do have a Q&A, and so I encourage anybody who has questions for any of the panelists to throw it in there, and I will pick and choose it in a completely centralized fashion. But maybe we can undermine this with some Web 3.0 separate Q&A session that's going on out there somewhere with actual cash prizes. So, but I have one question, again, moderator's privilege. I think there was an interesting contrast, right? Where Andrew and Kevin were like, well, I think we got it right. And then Cleve and Carlos were talking about, well, actually the current internet sucks. So I have a question about this, which is sort of, if we see the current internet as I said, the incumbents now, is what's going to happen now that Web 3.0 is going to replace or bring down those incumbents? And does it have an opportunity to fix the problems that we've seen? And I guess for the bonus point, what do you see as those problems in particular? Cleve, you first raised this, and maybe I overstated when I said it, sorry.
No, you're absolutely correct. The internet is broken. It does not suck because we use it so much, right? We've become so dependent of it. The problem is the internet was supposed to decentralize us, right? It was supposed to be this decentralized platform for the world, but it ended up to be a centralized space that's controlled by a handful of people. That is not decentralization. So at some point, we went the wrong way, right? Data sharing was important, but data mining and selling people's data was not where we should be. So I do think it's how the internet has been used, how it's been the architecture of it. And I do think this conversation now about Web3 and the capacity to leverage artificial intelligence to inject decentralized tools like smart contracts, like DeFi, is revolutionary and can actually, close some of those fault lines, address some of those gaps, but also put us back on track. So I would say we're not trying to eliminate the current internet and start all over. I think it is how can we, address some of the issues, but certainly leverage new technologies and then create a more secure place where trust is restored.
Kevin, so Cleve pointed out this thing of the part of the selling point of the original internet, that it wasn't an AOL, it wasn't one of these proprietary networks, and it was going to decentralized power. What do you think went wrong? And do you think it's the role of regulators or technologists to kind of fix that?
Well, first of all, a lot went wrong, but it's important, and Cleve alluded to this, not to make it seem as though nothing happened because of the internet and we're all somehow enslaved to our new lords and masters. There's tremendous empowerment of billions of people all around the world because of the internet, even in an environment where we see very prominently the downsides of the big dominant platforms and the way markets have consolidated. So, I mean, I tend to think that it's really easy to reduce these things to very simple good and evil, one thing disrupts the other or not, when really it's a lot more complicated. It's typically not the case that the new services directly frontally confront and replace the old ones. So the internet has transformed media, but you look at the massive media companies that are out there today, many of them are companies that were around before. It's totally transformed financial services, but you look at Wall Street and many of the big players are still there. And much of what happened, it's not that Google came along and did exactly what Microsoft was doing before and outcompeted Microsoft. Guess what? Microsoft is still around as an internet company. The new companies generally tend to, if they're going to be really successful, do something different. There are these edge cases. There are cases like the voice over IP service where it's providing telephony in direct competition. But most of the time what we see is really an evolution of the market. So the new providers and the new communities have a challenge. They need to get to scale. And there are strong network effects, which just inherently lead to consolidation and centralization at some level, even when the underlying technology is fundamentally decentralized at some level. So I think it's a mistake to think about this as everything now is totally centralized and everything tomorrow with Web3 is going to be totally decentralized. It's a matter of understanding what's the value that gets created, to whom. And in that process, regulators absolutely have a role. Regulators, I think where they went wrong, and Andrew, I expect would agree with me, was when the big tech platforms started becoming significant, not realizing what had changed. Because all of these Silicon Valley companies, these were the entrants. These were the new guys coming in, going against the big incumbents. And there was a point where there was a necessity for policymakers to realize, well, no, these guys have become big now. And they should have certain kinds of obligations to not stamp out newer innovations that come after. And so we need to have that constant dialogue. And we also need to understand which services are in regulated areas. So one interesting thing about a lot of this blockchain and cryptocurrency-based innovation is it's in finance in a way that the early internet services in the 90s weren't. Finance is a regulated industry, and for good reason. We don't want people to have completely unconstrained ability to get scammed by anyone, because we know time and time again that's what will happen. But we need to think about when those regulations had the unintended consequences of entrenching the incumbents and raising the cost, as Carlos was saying, preventing, for example, people having access to the banking system. Absolutely, regulators in some cases are the cause of the problem, but they really have to have a role as well in solving those problems.
Yeah, I'll add that with the proposals that we see right now, I think that they definitely take this sort of consumer rights model, right? The interest, I think, of most lawmakers is in protecting people, as you say, from scams or losing more money than they can accept. Andrew, in the old internet, I think that there was a lot more discussion about, how do we democratically manage this at the global level? And Wolfgang Klein, I'm going to murder this name.
Kleinvector.
Ganz genau. mentioned something that was a bit of a catchphrase in the early internet, which is multi-stakeholder approach, right? Where you have government, tech companies, and nonprofits or the users themselves working together to work these policies. Do you think that's something that will, particularly in a world where you know, a lot of blockchain people, a lot of Web 3.0 people are organizing around these decentralized DAOs, right? A different form of organizing. Do you think that still holds promise in this new period?
Well, I mean, I'd answer it this way. I think that to me, the most exciting thing about blockchains and distributed technologies is this vast kind of ocean of experiments in governance that we see taking place right now. I could not be more fascinated by the rise of things like distributed autonomous organizations and other efforts to self-govern technologies, to self-govern resources. I think that's amazing. Whether the old multi-stakeholder model, you know, was kind of like a success or a failure depends on what test you set up for it. So, you know, by the test that we set out initially, which is that the domain name system should be reliable, and it has really been reliable, that it should be global and preserve global interconnectivity, it has done that, and that it should be basically low cost to the user, and it is basically done that. Anybody can get a domain name for $6 a year or something like that. So anyway, like by one measure, that's been a wild success. On the other hand, and I say this as a you know, loving alumnus of the organization, but when I look at ICANN right now, I think it is highly susceptible to the critique that it is captured by economically interested actors that flood the open multi-stakeholder zone with participants that take advantage of open process. And I don't think that ICANN has gone off the rails at all. I think it's operated within, you know, a good set of like norms and bounds, but its decisions have made a lot of money for a small number of people that went into the process with a lot of money. And so to me, that's not like a great, you know, I wouldn't give that like an A. That was, you know, some like worse grade than that. I mean, so I think one of the things that's super exciting is to see how focused, participant-oriented governance can emerge and can basically be baked into new products, new services, new infrastructures. I'm very much in love with that. I think that's one of the cool things happening right now.
Cleve, what drew you into the crypto space, and who do you think is being unrepresented in this conversation and the conversation in DC right now? Oh, did Cleve freeze? Oh no. Oh no, we lost Cleve.
It happened to be earlier, as long as we're talking about freezing up. I got bounced and then I had to come back on. So
oh, no.
maybe that'll happen to her.
It also happened to me as well before, but I'm back now.
This is because we're dependent on Web 2.0 and they know what we're talking about. Okay, well, I'll turn to some
Danny,
of the...
can I maybe just vamp on one quick point and then we'll see if Cleve gets back on. So here, the one thing which is like, okay, so what's like a real lesson to learn from the past? I think there's just one that maybe is worth calling out here, which is this, which is that with any new set of infrastructures, not just the participants, the providers of the services, the builders of the infrastructure, but also regulators, on behalf of the public interest, legislators and regulatory agencies. One of the things that you absolutely have to do is plan for abuse, plan for misuse, plan for the terrible things that people are going to do. I spent about a year working at Tumblr. Tumblr was a free hosting platform for images and videos. And guess what? It had a colossal amount of porn, including illegal child sex abuse imagery that would show up on the platform. And you know, the company at the time I was there was like learning how to deal with it, learning how to automate tools, learning how to automate detection, learning how to deal with it. When I was at Google, we launched a social network called Orchid that got wildly popular in Brazil and India. And Google was way behind the curve when it came to provisioning support to be able to even just read and respond to user-generated reports about abusive behavior. And a lot of terrible stuff was taking place on the platform, and Google had to like figure out how to like get ahead of provision. So a thing that is smart for everybody to do when you're building a decentralized technology is think through. Doesn't mean that you have to like follow one particular solution, but think through how are people potentially going to abuse it. If they can, and it's cheap and it's possible, they will. And so you just have to think that through, and you've got to know how you're going to respond to it. And in some cases, particularly around financial services, the imperative of consumer protection requires that regulators get involved in order to fulfill their mandate to protect the public interest. What form that takes is another question, but leaving, kind of like regulators off the arena just on the hope that people aren't going to use new technologies for obviously, capable misuses is a mistake.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And actually, I'll throw in a really good link. This is by one of the FFDW funds explorations of the decentralized web for the public good. And a great project that we fund is the Starling Lab, which preserves Holocaust testimony from the Shoah Foundation, but actually multiple genocides before and after from live victims in a protected, decentralized way. And they asked Rebecca McKinnon to talk a little about what the Web 2.0 got wrong and what the Web 3.0 should be thinking about. Cleve, I'm so glad you're back. We have a hard stop, I've been told, at 4. But I'd like to give you the last word because I was just about to ask you when you got thrown off. But my question is, like, from your experience actually in the crypto community, one of the hardest things we had in Web 1.0 is getting the people who knew about the technology and were affected by it into the Washington conversation. Who do you think is not being represented in DC right now? And hey, in the questions and answers that we've had now.
Yes, I do think obviously representation is very important. Clearly, we have a lot to do in terms of the crypto space, in terms of diversity and inclusion. But I do think that, regulators have a role to play, and they have to make sure they're speaking to all stakeholders. The crypto community is much more diverse than people think. I know you put in the chat the Time Magazine article that talked about, Black and Latinx innovators. It's pretty diverse. But one of the challenges I would put to legislators, Washington regulators, is to actually look at, how they're looking at consumer protections and make sure that they're not using it as a tool to keep innovators of color out, because too much protectionism can be a challenge. And then the last thing I would say, I know we have to close, is the fact that we have to close the digital divide. Government can actually take that into consideration. And in the crypto community, as we build, we have to think about that as well. Because it doesn't matter if it's Web 1, Web 2, or Web 3. If we don't close the digital divide, many people will still be left out. And that would be a failure if we keep moving forward, not understanding that accessibility is a big problem.
Yes. I mean, there's so much to talk about. Thank you so much to all our guests for just really opening this discussion. I remember the very beginnings of Web 1.0, the biggest job was to just sort of understand. There was a very short transition between the people who were the explorers really understanding this and then desperately running back to explain this to the people who have the responsibility of guiding these new technologies for the benefit of everyone. So again, thank you to all our guests. Thank you to the Internet Caucus Academy for allowing us to have this time. If you have any questions, you can find us all on LinkedIn and ask us. And I believe there are a number of events happening right now around the Filecoin's annual anniversary. So I think we're doing more in DC, and I think we'll see much more discussion about this. So thank you again, Andrew, Kevin, Carlos.
Thank you, Danny.
Cleve, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Record.